Hi, welcome to day 9 of SABR Virtual. I am your host for the day, Jacob Pomrenke. We have an exciting program for you today, which is opening day of the MLB season in 2020. So thank you all for being here. Our presentations today are going to focus on pitching with a few interesting twists. Steve Treder and Nick Elam are going to be talking about the history and future evolution of strikeouts and the strike zone, while Christina Knoedler will dive into the physics of how weather patterns affect pitched balls. And Chuck Hildebrandt will get us all started with a lively conversation on the year of the Balk. So a quick programming note for everybody here today. We'd like to remind you that this session is being recorded and it will be posted online on SABR's YouTube channel afterwards, where you can also watch replays of the first 2 weekends of SABR Virtual presentations right now. If you do not wish to be recorded, you are free to leave the meeting now. In order for us to stay on time today, we'll be taking all questions in the Zoom chat window on the side of your screen. So please type in all your questions on the chat and the speakers can answer when their presentations are over. Please also remember to set your microphones to mute and turn your cameras off so we can save on bandwidth and everyone can hear the speakers clearly. Thank you for joining us for SABR Virtual today. We hope you enjoy the show. Leading off is Chuck Hildebrandt. Chuck is a 2-time Doug Pappas Award winner for his oral presentations on Little League home runs in 2015 and changing leagues and player performance in 2017. He has also authored 3 articles for SABR's Baseball Research Journal, including the cover story for the spring 2015 edition on the retroactive All-Star Game project. Chuck is the founder of the Baseball and the Media Committee back in 2013, and he currently serves as chair emeritus of that committee. He's a Detroit native who's a proud Tigers fan, even through their frequent rebuilding stages. And he lives with his lovely wife, Terry, in Chicago, where he's doing his best to dodge pandemic viruses, but still playing in a rec softball league while recovering from various knee injuries. Chuck's presentation today is What the Balk is Going On Here, baseball's most difficult to master rule and the season it broke. So Chuck, take it away.
All right, let's share. All right. Okay, here we go. Remember this guy? If we were live on stage in Baltimore, I'd be asking, okay, who knows who this is? And probably a couple of dozen people would murmur, Ron Luciano, and they would be right. Now, some of you already know why I'm showing him, but for the rest of you, Ron Luciano had a famous quote. I never called a balk in my life. I didn't understand the rule. Well, I don't know how accurate that is. 105 balks were called by Ron's umpiring crews during his 11 years, but it is a colorful quote meant to convey just how difficult it can be, even for big league umpires, to recognize a balk when it happens. So if a big league umpire has trouble with it, what chance do we have? Well, we'd have a better chance if we knew what a balk actually is. A surprising number of even knowledgeable fans aren't clear on that. So here's a simple definition straight from the MLB website. A balk occurs when a pitcher makes an illegal motion on the mound that the umpire deems to be deceitful to the runners. So the pitcher can't make motions to fool runners because it gives them an unfair advantage. It's about maintaining competitive balance between pitchers and runners. So the balk concept goes back to the very beginning of the game, meaning the Knickerbocker rules of 1845 developed by Alexander Cartwright, the father of modern baseball. There were 20 rules in all, and Rule 19 stated, a runner cannot be put out making one base when a balk is made by the pitcher. So right in the very beginning, there was a recognition that a pitcher committing an illegal act to deceive base runners was wrong and needed to be punished. The first known description of what constituted a balk came in 1867 in rules adopted by the National Association of Baseball Players. Just a few simple acts were described. A ball must be pitched and not jerked or thrown. If a pitcher makes a move like he's going to deliver a pitch, he has to deliver a pitch. And he must deliver the ball from behind the front line and with both feet in contact with the ground. And if the pitcher fails in either of these particulars, which I love that language, that's a balk. Throughout the 19th century, new deceptive acts were added to the balk rules. Here's a list, I'll just paraphrase. Unnecessary delay of game, pitching from outside the pitcher's box and later without a foot on the rubber, continuing to throw overhanded after being warned, that one didn't last long, standing on the rubber without the ball, faking a throw to a base. All these were added by 1898 as a way to prevent pitchers from taking unfair advantage of base runners. As the balk rule got fleshed out during the 19th century, the effect on balks called, not really great. Total number for the entire National League in any given season was in the single digits, with a minor tick up in 1898 after new balk actions were added. Then, in 1899, a major new balk action was added to the rules that had a real impact. If a pitcher threw to a base in an attempt to pick off a runner without first stepping toward that base, that was now a balk. Now, this was a big deal because pitchers would routinely throw from a dead standstill, or they'd step toward the plate with an apparent intention of pitching, only to twist their upper body and fling the ball to first, hoping to catch the runner in the early act of stealing. Clearly unfair. And balks did increase by 4x, going from 15 in 1898 to 61 in 1899, the first great balk spike in baseball history. Didn't last though. Balks went right back down to 16 in 1900 and stayed down. That's the newfangled American League in Orange, by the way. The next balk spike occurred in 1904 when National League President Harry Pulliam ordered strict interpretation of the balk rule. He said, this year, pitchers must stand directly in front of the pitcher's plate with both feet on the ground. He is not allowed to bend his knees, shrug his shoulder, or move his arms and hands as in delivering a ball, unless he pitches the ball. And this was targeted at pitchers, quote, who have the habit of working their arms and raising their hands several times before delivering the ball. This directive led to balks spiking by 6x, from a total of 6 in 1903 to 34 in 1904. That's just the blue part. Now, balks in the National League dropped back to 24 in 1905 and then kept dropping throughout the decade. For the next 40 years, not much going on with the balk rule in either league. Minor changes here and there, but nothing causing wild spikes. In fact, the main problem, as baseball people saw it, was that umpires were not calling enough balks. Pitchers were considered to be getting away with balk moves all the time, to the detriment of base stealing, which by 1949 had fallen into an all-time low. So when the Rules Committee met after the 49 season, they made a couple of changes. One defined the set position for the first time. When the pitcher takes the set position, you cannot then go to the stretch without drawing a balk. He must stretch first, then set. That was considered the big change. And almost as an aside, they also tweaked the pause that a pitcher must take before pitching from the set. The old rule said he had to come to a stop. The new rule was complete stop of at least 1 second. Well, it quickly became apparent which change was going to be more important. After 13 balks violating the 1 second rule were called in their first 2 spring games, Giants manager Leo DeRocher said, this is a farce. The pitchers are pitching the same way they always did, but now it's a balk. Didn't matter. Baseball was committed to going through with the change. Within the first 3 weeks of the season, the National League here in Orange had called 30 balks, already more than all of last season, while the AL called 19. You think that's something? Pacific League umpires called 49 balks in the first week alone. Then they called another 49 balks in the second week. After racking up 179 balks in just the first month, it was considered such a problem, they abandoned the 1 second rule in mid-June. Not the majors, though. They stuck with the rule for the whole year. The balks eventually waned, either because umpires let up or pitchers adapted, but by the end of the season, National League umpires had called 81 balks, the most of any season to date. And even the more lax American League rung up a record 47. But despite complaints, the leagues considered the 1 second rule a success and mandated that umpires continue enforcing it for 1951. But again, whether umps enforced it less or pitchers adapted, balks dropped to 32 in the National League and 33 in the American League. The balks dwindled over the next few years, going as low as 13 in the NL. Each league ticked up into the 30s for a few years and then a bump up in 1962, perhaps due to expansion. And then Joey J happened. Now remember how 1962 was the year Maury Wills ran wild with 104 stolen bases? Joey J came up with what he thought was an effective way to deal with it. Now J developed 2 motions. In his more common motion, he would stand with his free foot behind the rubber and his right foot on it. His hands would be clasped, you get the sign. And then he would move into the stretch position. Then he would take the common set position, free foot in front of the rubber, and then pitch. But every once in a while, he would start the same way, free foot behind the rubber, hands clasped, get the sign, but then immediately pitch, like a quick pitch. Now, even though opposing managers cried balk, League President Warren Giles approved the move for the rest of the season. When the Rules Committee met that winter to tweak the Balk rule to address the J motion, they also noticed that there had been an appalling lack of enforcement of the 1-second rule, still in effect since 1950, as pitchers had gotten to the habit of sliding their hands downward during the hesitation instead of truly stopping. Right from the start of spring, National League umpires listened. As a result, 1963 started out in a way that put 1950 to shame. In the first 4 weeks alone, 98 balks were called by National League umpires, already a season record. American League umpires called a grand total of 9. I'll let you guess which color is which. On May 6th, the word came down to umpires from the league: lay off the balks already. 1 week later, baseball voted to drop the 1-second rule completely. Now, during the remaining 21 weeks, only 49 balks were called in the NL and 38 in the AL. So the year ended with 194 total balks, a record by a lot. With the 1-second rule officially dead, balk calls dropped closer to historic norms. The next 5 years saw between 65 and 101 balks per season, with a tick up to 132 in the expansion year of 1969, then 129 in 1970, then back below 100 for the next 3 seasons. Then 1974 happened. Baseball experimented with a balk line in spring training that year, requiring a pitcher to step across marked guidelines when throwing to first or to third to pick off runners. If a pitcher stepped on the line or on the wrong side of the line, umps were told to call a balk. Baseball killed the balk line before the season, but National League umpires must have internalized it somehow, because balks in that league shot up from 52 to 140, while the AL stayed stable at 47. And that's how it went through the rest of the century, by the way, with the National League outbalking the American League on literally an every year basis. In fact, starting in 1969, the playoff era, the National League outbalked the American in 30 of 31 seasons by no less than 12% and by as much as 206%. So as far as that's concerned, this was a typical season. Now, after 1974, balk calls skyrocketed. Baseball broke its 1963 record in 1975. Another new record set in 1977, then 1978, then 1984, then 1986, then 1987, when they smashed the 300 mark for the first time, and by a long shot. Ink was spilled by the gallons that season on articles in newspapers and magazines about balk crisis run amok. Public awareness reached the apex during the 1987 World Series, when Cardinals manager Whitey Herzog famously claimed that the Twins' Bert Blyleven committed 19 uncalled balks during Game 1 alone. It became one of the bigger stories of the offseason. And then it happened. At the Rules Committee meeting that winter, baseball made a change to the balk rule that added an odd new phrase to the baseball lexicon. Pitchers must now make a discernible stop during the set position before releasing the ball. How long is a discernible stop? It's up to each umpire to figure that out for himself. Now, it's the kind of thing that gets buried in the 3rd paragraph of a 3-paragraph feature on rules changes for the upcoming season, as you see here in the New York Daily News. Nobody said boo about the change for the next 3 months. But as soon as spring training started, the balk started its own campaign to work its way to the front pages of the nation's sports section. The first shot came when Charlie Huff was called for 9 balks in 4 innings during his first spring start. That by itself would have tied the American League record for balks in an entire season held by Charlie Huff, set in 1987. 82 balks were called in just the first 85 spring games. Bert Blyleven, the guy Whitey Herzog chided all through the World Series the prior October, charged that Commissioner Peter Ueberroth saw strict balk enforcement as a way to goose offense. Why doesn't he run for president like he wants to and get out of baseball, Blyleven said. By the end of spring training, umpires had called hundreds of balks. So if anyone was in midseason form coming out of camp, it was the balk calling umpires. And they did get off to a rousing start. Opening day alone saw 11 balks called, including 3 on Roger Clemens, matching his total for all of 1987. 1 week into the season, there were already 74 balks called in 73 games. Dan Quisenberry was called for the first balk of his career April 9th against the Tigers. He had pitched nearly 900 career innings without one. The pace ramped up in week 2, 88 more balks called in just 75 games. That ironically totaled 162 balks in just the first 2 weeks. At that rate, umpires would rack up over 2,300 balks before the season's end. Sparky Anderson said, Jack Morris is one of the biggest offenders in all of baseball, but now he's totally cured. If my guy has to do it, I'm going to make sure they enforce it for everyone, or else I'm going to raise hell. Morris would end up leading the Tigers with 11 balks that season. Real cured. Balks tailed off only slightly for week 3, 56 balks in 74 games. Catfish Hunter said, if they'd have called him like this years ago, Jim Palmer would never have won a game. He never came to a real stop. He could have been called for a balk every time. Week 4 saw another slight tailing off, only 45 balks, but by itself still on pace for over 1,300 for a whole season. Manager Tom Kelly was not thrilled when his Twins beat the Indians on a walk-off balk. We win the damn game on a balk, a 7-6 game with home runs and doubles and the balls flying all around, and look what we're in here talking about, balks. That's a shame. Week 5 ticked back up, 63 more balks called. Mike Downey wrote in his Los Angeles Times column, the balk used to be called 3 times a month. Now it's being called 3 times a game. Umpires are going around saying balk, balk, balk. They sound like chickens. Week 6 saw another 44 balks called. That Saturday, the Braves met the Cardinals in St. Louis. In the bottom of the 12th inning, Rick Mahler of the Braves committed the 357th balk called in the major leagues that season, breaking the all-time record set just the season before. The date was May 14th. By the way, that did not break the National League record. That would come on the 4th of July. As for the American League record, that was broken back on April 23rd. The pace kept up for week 7, 42 balks called. After 5 balks were called in his Brewers against the Yankees, manager Tom Trebelhorn said, the umpires are concentrating so much on the balk rule that I get the feeling I could put an extra outfielder out there and they wouldn't even notice it. Week 8 saw right reasonable, but project just week 8 out to a whole season, that would still work out to a record-setting 560. And of course, week 9 saw the number of balks jump right back up to 38. Tony Lansford was at the plate in the Tigers-A's game. He grounded out to second, but Tiger pitcher Don Heinkel was called for a balk. So Lansford came back to the plate and hit a home run. First time I've ever gone 1 for 2 in the same at-bat. A Sporting News survey of players, managers, and coaches was published in June that found that 13% thought the balk rule interpretation that year was beneficial, 44% said it was harmful, and 43% found it neither helpful nor harmful. In the article that ran with the poll, a lot of guys had some very specific reasons for what they thought was wrong with balkomania, mostly focused on inconsistency and pointlessness. Paul Molitor said, in the past there were a few instances where there was a controversy. Now with the change, there's constant controversy. Jim Leland said, I've seen a pitcher do something with one umpiring crew and have nothing called, then do the same thing with another crew and have it called a balk. And Robin Yount said, a team is up by 14 runs and a balk will be called. The umpires are getting carried away. That literally happened, by the way. On May 5th, the Red Sox were beating the White Sox 16-2 in the 8th inning, and Boston pitcher Dennis Lamp got flagged for a balk. Despite the complaints of ball players and their coaches, the balks just kept coming. 27 more in week 10, then 40 more in week 11, then 30, then 38, then 39. By the end of the first half of the season going into the All-Star break, the major leagues had seen an astounding 645 balks, with the whole second half of the season looming. And of course, the balk was the talk of the All-Star game as well. And how could it not be? But of course they'd be tough in the All-Star game, because why not? And did you notice how annoyed Whitey Herzog was, the godfather of the discernible stop, how annoyed he got when the balk was called? Ah, Schadenfreude, what would we do without you? Week 15 saw only 14 balks because, of course, it was a short All-Star week. But then the balk rate slowed to a relative trickle, as they did in other spike years, mostly in the low 20s per week for the rest of the season. Neither the nation's newspapers nor the sporting news seemed to take notice of that, maybe because even the least balky week would project to a record number for the season. By the time 1988 ended, a grand total of 924 balks had been called, completely obliterating the record of 356 from just the year before. To illustrate just how dramatic that is, there were as many balks called in about 2,100 games just in 1988 as in the more than 29,000 games in the first 24 years of the modern baseball era. Just as dramatic, remember when I told you that National League umpires called more balks in 30 of 31 seasons starting in 1969? The 1 year the American League led was 1988. The American League called 558 balks against 366 in the NL. The NL increase was high at 67%. The increase for the AL was over 300%. And that shows there was a fundamental difference for decades in how NL umpires called balks. That they were always harder on pitchers not taking enough time in the set position, as in 1950 and 1963 by explicit direction, and starting in 1974 by custom. AL umpires wildly overcorrected, and this was the result. Well, it all became too much for the baseball establishment, and so on January 26, 1989, the Rules Committee put a discernible stop to the new balk interpretation that had led to one of the most ridiculous seasons in baseball history. And they must have figured, hey, as long as we're embracing the reasonable and rejecting the ridiculous, why don't we get rid of that silly game-winning RBI too? That stat was so 80s. The prologue to the 1988 season, the thing that fans don't realize or remember or maybe never even learned, the 1989 season saw what is now the second most balks called in history, 407, a full 51 more than 1987, the previous bridesmaid of balk-happy seasons. I guess as hard as it is for pitchers to break old habits to keep from balking, it's just as hard for umpires to break old habits to keep from calling balks. And as baseball moved into the 90s, balks trended down, and by 1996, the number for a full season had dropped under 200, pretty much for good. Now these days, balk calls are running right around 150 a season, the lowest rate since the early 1970s. That is, fewer balks are being called per game than at any time in the past half century. You know what? I don't think anybody really misses those balk years. Hey, time for our ever popular Did You Know segment. Did you know that batters were awarded first base on all balks starting with the 1899 season? And that batters continue to be awarded first base during the 1900 season for all except the two most common types of balks? And that the rule went away starting in 1901, rendering it completely unknown by the baseball fans of 120 years hence? It's true. It's the more you know. I'm done.
That was a terrific presentation, Chuck. Always entertaining. We've got some time for some Q&A, so if anyone wants to ask questions, please type them into the chat window, and then we will ask the questions here. First question is from Mike Halpert. He says, was the 1988 increase in balks a problem due to the new rule, or was it because of the way umpires were forced to interpret it?
That's a good question. I mean, you know, chicken egg. They were already calling a record number of balks leading up to the 1988 season. 1987 was the highest balk year in history up to that point, battering 1986. I think they were already in the balk calling mood, and they just got supercharged for 1988. And even though they removed the discernible stop rule, for 1989, they were still calling just a load of balks, so much that it was the second highest balk calling season in history. So it was just a very, very weird time in baseball history that I kind of hope is never repeated.
So speaking of that, you showed on your charts that balks had been rising pretty rapidly starting in the early 1970s. So, I mean, even though 1988 was even more of an outlier than any other season, you know, all throughout the 80s, they had been setting records for balks. So was it something to do with, you know, which umpires were in the leagues? Balk and Bob Davidson is probably the most famous umpire in terms of balks, but, you know, were there other umpires that had come into the league and were calling more balks than, you know, some of the older ones?
Well, you know, there are umpires that were known for calling more balks than others. Like Jacob Pomrenke was like the top balk caller of 1950. And so as a matter of fact, you know, home and first base umpires call basically more than 80% of all the balks. One of the rules committee guys confirmed that for me. And the tandem of Jacob Pomrenke and Artie Gore in 1950 called 16 balks, which is double what Babe Pinelli and Dustin Bojas called. But in 1988, it was kind of interesting because it seemed like the top balk caller was, you know, Frank Pulley, and Jerry Crawford was also a top calling balk. Was a top calling ump at balks. The Jerry Crawford Doug Harvey tandem called 18 balks in 12 games between them, and the Doug Harvey Frank Pulley tandem called 15 balks in 16 games among them. And for 1989, Frank Pulley and Bob Davison, and with the highest balk calling umpires, and Doug Harvey and Frank Pulley were second. So it's definitely a situation where, you know, certain umpires are more want to call balks than other umpires. And I could also look at a list of umpires, even in 1988, who would have called like maybe one balk in 15 games. So it was very much what the umpire was willing to see and willing to call. But the league definitely supercharged that willingness for that 1 year.
Tara Krieger asked, she says, she remembers that Andy Pettit had an incredible pickoff move early in his career that he had to abandon because umps were calling balks on him. When the AL-NO umpire merger happened in the late 1990s, did the balk rule change, or did the interpretation change at all for that?
Well, the interpretation definitely changed when they changed the rule, or when they got rid of the discernible stop rule. I think probably what changed, well, I think part of what changed it was the consolidation of umpires under the auspices of Major League Baseball in 2000. All the way up through 2000, the National League was still calling more balks than the American League was. So after that, where National League umpires calling more balks than American ex-National Leaguers calling more than ex-American Leaguers, perhaps, but you know, pretty much by the 2010s, that pretty much got ironed out, so that today we're seeing probably historic norms, but versus the last half century, it's you know, it's really at a low point. So I think it probably is. It's really more moved down by custom among umpires than any particular, you know, need to be hard on pitchers balking.
So a question going back to the very, very early days of pitching history. Peter Cottrell asked a question about the balk is mentioned in the Knickerbocker rules of 1845, but it's not defined until 1867. Do you know what you know, the balk rules were, or the interpretations were back then?
So I looked around to try to figure out did they have a different idea of what a balk meant, because as we know, 1845 was a very different game than even 1867 was. We know how different 1867 was from anything that came after it. It apparently became, I think it probably was a situation where, you know, once base running became more important, once stealing became important, then, you know, batters or runners would try to get an edge on pitchers, and pitchers would try to get an edge on runners, and the pitchers had the natural advantage of holding the ball and choosing the moment at which they got to release the ball in whatever direction they wanted to. So that's why, you know, the balk would come down on the pitcher rather than putting any restraint on the runner necessarily. But you know, in terms of, you know, what is it about the balk that evolved into 22 years, or how was it interpreted in those 22 years? That's still kind of a mystery to me, unfortunately.
Okay. All right. Well, appreciate your time, Chuck. Always entertaining presentations. And this one is on a subject that, for those of us who remember the 1988 season, that's one of the unforgettable aspects of that year.
Definitely is. Well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right. So before we get started with Steve Treder's presentation, I want to remind everybody that you still have one more day to enter the SABR Virtual raffle. You have a chance to win a lineup card autographed by Tony Gwynn, a Hank Aaron vintage figurine from Heartland, limited edition prints of Lou Gehrig and Old Yankee Stadium, and other baseball memorabilia prizes. Each $5 raffle ticket entitles you to a chance to win one of these prizes, which will be drawn at random this weekend and announced during the final SABR Virtual session on Sunday, July 26th. Raffle tickets are open. You can purchase them on sabr.org until Friday night on July 24th. So buy them online at sabr.org/virtual-meetings. So next up, we have Steve Treder. And he wrote for the Hardball Times for more than 10 years, writing regular columns on baseball history. His work has also been featured in Nine, The National Pastime, and many other baseball publications. He has frequently been a presenter at baseball forums such as the SABR National Convention, the Nine Spring Training Conference, and the Cooperstown Symposium at the Baseball Hall of Fame. Very soon, the University of Nebraska Press will be publishing his book, 40 Years a Giant, The Life of Horace Stoneham. His presentation today is called The Triumph of the Whiff, A History of the Strikeout. So please take it away, Steve.
Well, thank you very much, Jacob, and thank you to everybody at SABR. I am sharing my screen. There we go. It is always my distinct privilege and pleasure to be able to present to my friends at SABR. It's really, truly one of my favorite things to do. Oops. Go back to the beginning here. There we go. In fact, I'm so delighted to be presenting today that I won't even bring up the fact that they have scheduled us today to compete directly with baseball's opening night. I won't even bring that up, nor will I even make any mention at all of that time back in 2017 when we were in New York and you scheduled me to follow Keith Olbermann. Won't even make a mention of that today. So.
Hey, Steve, it looks like your screen is not sharing right now. So if you want to hit the share screen button one more time.
Let me try this again then. Let me go there and hit that, share screen. Oh, that's probably why. Let me try it again. No. One participant can share at a time, it tells me. And I'm clicking on the PowerPoint and you're not seeing it?
Not seeing it yet.
It worked perfect in the rehearsal, everybody. It's asking me questions here. One participant can share at a time, multiple participants can share simultaneously, or advanced sharing options. I need to worry about that.
I don't think so.
Steve, you need to click the center of that button instead of the right side where it brings up the additional menu.
The center. I'm clicking it eagerly. I'm clicking it with great enthusiasm. It just keeps asking me these questions. One participant can share at a time, multiple participants can share simultaneously, or advanced sharing options. Select a window or an application you want to share. Yes, selected. Basic or advanced? Should just be basic, shouldn't it?
Should be.
Isn't it always the way that things go?
You know, I've got your presentation up here. I can share my screen here, and
we can do it. We can do it that way. Let's do
all
it
right.
that way.
Just tell me when to hit the button, and I'll switch to the next slide. So give me 1 second here.
So yeah, so we will be looking at your screen, and I was afraid this was going to happen. As you can see here, this is the version of the PowerPoint that I shared last March at the 9 conference. I didn't update it yet before I sent it to Jacob.
No.
But it's that was the very last public meeting I was at, and most of us were at. So today we're going to talk about the strikeout, a history of strike 3. You can advance the slide, please, Jacob.
Okay.
What are we looking at here? This is a line chart of the rate of strikeouts in Major League Baseball per team per game each season since 1893. I chose 1893 as the first year for this because that was the year when the pitching rubber distance was set at 60 feet 6 inches. So it's the sort of the beginning of the modern dimensions of the game and the physics of the pitcher and batter that exist to this day. So we see that line in the early years was very low. Strikeouts were very rare. But over the years and over the decades, there's been some ups and downs, but it has very definitely the long-term trend has been up and up and up. And as we see in 2019, the most recent baseball season, we set a new record for strikeouts, which would have been a big deal had not that just broken the previous record that was set in 2018, which broke the previous record that was set in 2017, which was set, et cetera, et cetera. We've seen every year since 2007, we've seen a new year for record for strikeouts, and just about every year since the late 1990s, we've seen an increase in strikeouts. So it is a very, very dramatic, it's a triumphant, if I might use that word, that the history of the strikeout is a history of triumph from the point of view of the strikeout. Why? How can we understand what is happening and what has happened and therefore be able to predict what is likely to continue to happen in the future? In order to understand that, we need to understand the strikeout not on its own, but in context of the other outcomes of plate appearances that may occur. So if you could advance the slide, please, Jacob. This is the same time frame, and the strikeout line there that you saw before is still here. That's the one in yellow. That's strikeouts per game. But now we're comparing it against other relevant events. The line at the top of the chart there, the green line, is the rate of hits per game. The red line is the rate of runs per game. The black line is the rate of bases on balls per game. And the dotted purple line that starts out there on the bottom and has a trajectory that is correlated fairly strongly with the strikeout line because it goes up and up and up, that is the rate of home runs per game. So it's really important that we understand that these events don't occur independently, but they impact one another from both the point of view of the batter and the pitcher. Oftentimes the tactic is to optimize the outcome of this, or the likelihood of this outcome versus the likelihood of that outcome, and playing off one risk against the other, understanding that if I do this and I make sure that this happens, I may pay the price in terms of that other thing happening. Both batters and pitchers, both offensive strategies and defensive strategies, face the same challenge. But in reacting back and forth to each other, and certainly in reaction to the various changes in the playing conditions, ballparks, rules, etc., that have happened over the years, these things have been constantly changing. I guess the one thing you could say is that change is the only constant. It has never been the case that this rate of all these things together has settled and come into some sort of balance that lasted for anything more than a few years. So let's break up this big long-term 126-year long piece of history, and let's break it up into its various eras and really focus on what exactly was happening at which time. If you could advance the slide, please, Jacob. This is the very first period, the period from 1893 to 1919. All those 5 variables are presented here in that period alone. This is the period that is generally referred to as the dead ball era because of the fact that the scoring was low generally through this era, but it wasn't low throughout at all. And the live ball was actually introduced in 1910. And as you can see, when it was introduced, it brought about a little mini spike in hitting and scoring, but it didn't last. The other big rule change or big conditional change that took place during this era was in 1903, when a third foul ball or a foul ball with 2 strikes was considered no strikeout. So batters weren't striking out with a third foul. That had the impact of reducing. It made for a very deadened baseball game. The period through the 1900s was the lowest scoring sustained period in baseball history. But what we see throughout this entire period is that home run rate down there at the bottom, very, very low. Home runs were as rare through this period as they have been through any period in the history of Major League Baseball. Well, in an era when home runs are rare, that means in order to score, you have to put together a sequential offense. You have to put together multiple hits in a row. And in that circumstance, to strike out is a very, very bad thing. So it was in the interest of offenses to keep the rate of strikeouts low. And they generally did keep the rate of strikeouts low through this period. Ballparks, infields were bumpy. Gloves were in use, but they were by later standards still very rudimentary. So fielding was difficult. There were lots of errors. There were lots of balls that would be caught in later eras that were not captured in this era. So to put the ball in play was the very best way to optimize your chance of scoring, especially when you have a low rate of home runs. You're going to have to get at least 2 or 3 hits to score a run. So small ball was absolutely the way that the game was played. And in that context, striking out was the worst possible thing an offensive player can do. And so contact hitting was the mode of hitting that everybody was taught to do. Please advance the slide. The top stars, the very best hitters in the game. I've listed 4 here, but you could include others: Billy Hamilton, Eddie Collins, Tris Speaker. The one thing that all of them had in common was that they very, very rarely struck out. The best hitters in baseball did not strike out, but these guys weren't slap hitters. They weren't, this wasn't Wee Willie Keeler here. These guys were hitting the ball hard. They hit lots and lots of doubles and triples. They didn't hit a lot of home runs, but they hit lots of extra base hits. They hit the ball hard, but they were line drive hitters. Their mode of hitting was to avoid the strikeout. None of these guys ever led the league in strikeouts. The highest strikeout total from any one of these guys was 64 by Hannes Wagner in 1915 when he was 41 years old and very near the end of his career. The typical number of strikeouts for star hitters like this was 20, 30, maybe 40 at the high end strikeouts per year. Real men didn't strike out. These hitters, if we can imagine what their strokes looked like, they were very similar in style to more modern hitters such as George Brett or Tony Gwynn. They were line drive hitters. They hit the ball hard, but they weren't slugging for home runs. They were slugging for line drives and base hits. There were in this period a very few hitters who struck out as many as 100 times, but they were the very opposite of stars. They were scrubs and they quickly washed out of the major leagues. Clearly the ticket to stardom and success was to hit for a high average and to avoid striking out. Please advance the slide. What happened then? Well, we all know what happened then. Babe Ruth came along, and Babe Ruth changed everything. And certainly to some extent, Babe Ruth did change everything. Ruth, while he was a great hitter, he certainly had great hitting technique and instincts. He did not swing for line drives. He had a launch angle going. He swung, he had an uppercut, and he definitely tried to hit home runs. And of course, he was hugely successful, and the folklore is that Babe Ruth changed everything. He did not change everything. He changed a lot. In Ruth's wake, following his example, there were, within a few years, there were several other hitters who struck out a lot, as Ruth did, would also hit a lot of home runs and were hailed as stars, just as Ruth was. The latter 3 guys there, Wilson, Fox, and Camilli, all struck out over 100 times in a season. Or I guess not Wilson, but Fox and Camilli struck out over 100 times. Hank Greenberg struck out over 100 times in a season, but they all hit so many home runs and drove in so many runs. They were all recognized as legit stars. It was an era in which clearly there was a new mode of hitting star who hadn't ever been seen before. This was a new character on the scene of Major League Baseball. Please advance the slide. But while there were those few characters, Ruth and those few other slugging superstars, they were not typical. They were not common. While hitting and scoring went up in the 1920s, and the key event there wasn't the live ball, which had actually been introduced in 1910, the key triggering event was the outlawing of the spitball. And the way that you enforced the spitball and other kinds of defacing the ball, the way you enforced that rule was whenever a ball was defaced in any way, scuffed or scratched, it was thrown out of the game and a brand new white, clean ball was introduced. That had never happened before. That was the big event that triggered the offensive boom in the 1920s. But the offensive boom, while real, was an increase in hitting, in runs and hits, lots more doubles and triples and singles. But the rate of home runs, as you see, went up, but it didn't dramatically go up in the 1920s. And neither did the rate of strikeouts. It was up a little bit higher than it had been in early years, but basically what we see through this entire 25-year period is, as much as we've ever seen in history at baseball, a history of stability. Not a whole lot changed. There were no franchise moves. There were very few new ballparks introduced. There were some remodelings, but very few new ballparks. So things were very stable in terms of conditions and rules. In 1931, in reaction to the extremely live ball conditions that had occurred in 1930, the National League, though not the American League, the National League deadened its ball in 1931. And through the 30s, clearly there was a lower rate of scoring in the National League than the American because they used different kinds of balls. But still, overall, it didn't reduce scoring that much. The big change occurs in the 1940s here when World War II comes on the scene and the rubber is no longer allowed to be used to construct baseballs, and so they use balata and then other kinds of substitutes for rubber. That really deadens the ball, and so power hitting and scoring go down in World War II. But with that sort of caveat, this was an era of great steadiness, of great consistency in striking out and in everything else. I'll make mention here of one guy who's interesting to consider in this context, and that's Vince DiMaggio. I don't have a picture of him just because I'm lazy, but Vince DiMaggio, who had the fortune or misfortune to be Joe DiMaggio's older brother, shared a lot of characteristics with Joe, not with Dom. Dom was a little guy, but Joe and Vince were both big guys, power hitters. And like Joe, Vince was not only a power hitter, but he was a star center fielder defensively, great defensive center fielder. Unlike Joe, however, Joe was very old school, and although he hit for great power, he almost never struck out. Vince was quite the opposite. Vince struck out at record rates. He didn't hit for much average as a result of that. His batting average is usually about 250 or 270, but he had a good number of home runs, 15, 20 home runs a year, lots of doubles, a good power hitter. But he struck out a lot. He struck out a record 134 times in 1938. He put up stat lines which we would consider sort of typical, average of a typical ball player today, but they were bizarre within the context of his time. Vince DiMaggio was a harbinger, a ghost of strikeout's future of how things were about to change. Please advance the slide. So while the previous era was one of very little change, this was an era of all kinds of change. Starting, of course, with racial integration, the great increase in the talent pool, the quality of play dramatically increases over this period. This is a period of unprecedented franchise relocations. This is a period of not one, not two, not three, but 4 expansion drafts and 4 new teams added. This is the era in which the strike zone was changed officially in 1963 in an attempt to speed up the game that had the effect of reducing, increasing strikeouts. This was an era, and of course, then they reversed that change in 1969. But the one thing we see through all these changes is that the rate of strikeouts, which had been kind of stuck in a rut before, it really began to increase. Overall, the big change in baseball through this period is well, scoring is gradually going down. The number of hits is gradually going down. Batting average is going down, but strikeouts are going up. There's many things influencing this, of course, not just ballparks, but also tactics. We're seeing more and more use of relief pitchers. Bullpens are becoming much more sophisticated than ever before. We're seeing great improvements as quality of play improves. We're seeing great improvements in the quality of fielding. So there's less and less reward for hitters to put the ball in play. We see at this time many ballparks, many ownerships moving the fences in artificially, setting up chain link fences in the interior of their outfields in order to increase the number of home runs, because they correctly deduce that fans like home runs. And so by increasing home runs, they also increase the willingness of batters to swing for home runs, and so the rate of strikeouts goes up. Please advance the slide. This is the period in which we saw the strikeout record just fall over and over again. The left two characters there are in the American League. That's Jim Lemon there, the fellow on the left. He broke Vince DiMaggio's record, which had stood for 18 years. Lemon struck out 138 times in 1956. His record, however, did not stand for very long. It was broken in 1961 by Jake Wood, who struck out 141 times. That record was broken by Harmon Killebrew in 1962 with 142, and that record was broken by the next guy we see here, Dave Nicholson, in 1963, who struck out 175 times in 449 at-bats. Nicholson, unlike Lemon, was never able to successfully make it as a major league slugger, though he was given many, many chances. He struck out at appalling rates just completely unseen in previous eras, and was considered kind of a bust. But the fact that he was given that big chance was something unprecedented. Meanwhile, the two fellows on the right were in the National League. You may note the league that actually used black players through this era. A couple of people of note there. The first one is Richie, as he was known then, Richie Allen. Was just a phenomenal new kind of hitter when he broke in 1964. He struck out a lot, but he also hit for a very high average and didn't just hit home runs, but hit lots of doubles and lots of triples. He was just an amazing hitter who hit the ball really, really hard when he hit it, but he struck out a lot. He set a new National League record for strikeouts with 150 in 1965, and then would go on to hit to break his own record with 161 in 1968. And then we have the fellow on the right, Bobby Bonds. Bonds did not hit for the kind of average that Allen did, but he was still a dynamic all-around offensive player who stole lots and lots of bases along with hitting home runs. And Bonds struck out at remarkable rates. Bonds struck out in his first full season in the Major Leagues, 1969. He broke Nicholson's record by striking out 187 times, and then he broke that record right away in 1970 with 189 strikeouts. So clearly in this era, with the new conditions, there was a tolerance for high strikeouts, which had never been foreseen before. Advance the slide, please. So I don't have any Elvis Costello music to pump in here, but in your mind, please be thinking Elvis Costello as we think about this era. This era, of course, was another era of great change. The designated hitter is introduced. Through the 70s, it's the era of big ballparks and AstroTurf, but by the 80s, that's being phased out. The ballparks are getting smaller, the AstroTurf is being phased out, and the power hitting the rate is going up and up and up, and with it, the rate of strikeouts. Between 1988 and 1992, Major League Baseball changed the strike zone definition, or at least the instructions to umpires to call the strike zone, so that has sort of a temporary little dip in power hitting and striking out, but beginning in 1993, that vanished altogether, and we entered the silly ball era of the 1990s, the steroid era, the era in which hitting and scoring hit heights not seen since the 1930s. Power hitting was at unprecedented levels, but unlike the 1930s, this also saw new records again and again in the rate of strikeouts. Please advance the slide. Several of the characters from this era, Reggie Jackson set the all-time career record for strikeouts. He would strike out 150 times routinely, and nobody cared. Mike Schmidt, superstar inner circle Hall of Famer, everybody knew it. Struck out over 180 times, nobody cared. Dave Kingman and Rob Deere never broke through as stars, but they were understood to be very valuable players nonetheless, given long careers. While rarely hitting as high as 250, striking out at appalling rates. They were basically, if Dave Nicholson had been allowed to play, Dave Nicholson would have been Dave Kingman or Rob Deere. There was Sammy Sosa, who came along and hit 60 home runs in the 1990s, while regularly striking out 170 times. There was an acceptance of strikeouts by teams and by fans that had never been seen before. Please advance the slide. And so we come to the modern era, and the strikeout rate, we thought it was high before, it has simply gone up and up and up. The big changes here, the Questec imposition in the year 2001 sort of standardized the definition of the strike zone and had a temporary effect on stabilizing strikeouts, but it didn't last. PED testing came in 2006 and had some temporary impact on the rates of home run hitting, but sure didn't impact strikeouts. That just went up and up. While baseball has never admitted it, it certainly looks like the ball changed sometime around 2015, 2016, and we've seen an unprecedented spike in the rate of home runs since then, and the rate of strikeouts just goes up and up and up and up and up. We're seeing strikeouts today that just dwarf rates. In fact, in 2018, 2019, for the first time ever, it's more common to see a batter strike out than it is to see a batter get a base hit. Please advance the slide. I would call this the 200 club, but there's just way too many guys to fit on the page. These are the 4 hitters within recent years who have struck out more than 215 times in a season. This is a record which just does not show any signs of slowing down. This rate just keeps going up and up and up and up. Advance the slide, please. There are many causes for the most recent spike in strikeouts. Both offenses and defenses have agreed on one thing, which is that they're gonna do what they can to try and increase their advantage and not worry about strikeouts. Bullpens are used like never before. Pitching stints are shorter than ever before. Short relievers strike out batters at a rate unprecedented in history. And offenses don't care. Offenses see less and less value in putting the ball in play. Fielding is better than ever, especially with the shift. And so offenses say that the best way to beat the shift is to hit the ball over the fence. And so all the forces are in alignment that we're going to play the game in a way which increases our chance of winning, and we don't care what that does to the rate of strikeouts. Great for them. Players can do what they want. Teams can do what they want. But as a fan, as a consumer of the sport, I find this alarming. The strikeout is the one play, along with the base on balls, in which the ball is never put in play. A fielder never touches it. Fielding is not tested at all. A base runner never has to decide, do I go, do I stay, do I slide, do I stand up? There's no throw made to a base. There's no cutoff. There's no action on the field when the batter strikes out, and the batter is striking out over and over and over again without intervention, without making changes to the rules or the conditions under which the game is played. This line is not going to level off. It's going to continue to go up, and if this goes at the rate it's gone for the last 10 years, it's going to dwarf the rate of hits in a game. As a fan, I don't like it. I understand it, but I don't like it. So let's open up for some questions.
All right, thank you, Steve. That was very good and very informative history of the strikeouts. Wanted, if anybody has any questions, please ask them in the chat window, and we'll get to those very quickly. First question here is, do you think there is anything that Major League Baseball can do from the standpoint of rules or umpire interpretations, or anything that baseball can do to help encourage more balls in play and fewer strikeouts?
There are several. They could reduce the strike zone, of course, the size of the strike zone, but that would bring with it unintended consequences, like it would increase the number of base on balls. And just like the strikeout, the base on balls is a play without any action. They could increase the distance of the pitching rubber from 60 feet 6 inches to something further, which would reduce the velocity of pitches, which would allow batters to put the ball in play more regularly. They could reduce the size of fielders' gloves, make fielding harder to increase the reward for putting the ball in play. But I think the one thing that has the most impact, the most dramatic impact that they can do, is to increase the length of pitcher stints. Pitcher stints are getting shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. The shorter stints pitchers have, the more they can just throw as hard as they can, and they don't have to worry about pacing themselves and have to worry about pitching to contact. Until the rate of pitcher stints is increased by rule, this rate of strikeouts is going to continue to go up and up.
Okay, another question here from Stephen. Were there any significant differences in your research between starters and relievers, especially since relievers are being used more frequently and starters are not completing as many games today?
Yes, dramatically so. Throughout history, relievers have struck out batters at a greater rate than starters, just because, once again, they pitch shorter stints, and that difference has only grown. It used to be that relievers struck out batters at a slightly greater rate than starters. Now relievers strike out batters at a far greater rate than starters. Strikeouts don't occur evenly throughout the game. Through the first 5 or 6 innings, when the starters are still in, to the extent that they are, we see strikeouts at roughly historical rates. But in the late innings, once the parade of relievers starts coming in, the rate of strikeouts soars and is far higher than ever before seen in baseball.
Okay. Andy McHugh asked, given that the long-term rate of runs per game is relatively flat, what do you think the rationale is for emphasizing launch angle and home runs and accepting more strikeouts when it doesn't seem to lead to more run scoring?
Well, we don't have a test case. We don't know if it wouldn't lead to more run scoring if they didn't do it. And the calculation that offenses have made is that this is the only way they can beat these relievers and the only way they can beat the shift. They can't put together a long sequence offense. They can't string together 3 and 4 hits like they used to because it's so much harder to hit. So the only way they can score is to hit the home runs, which the whole cycle, it stimulates itself. The more they do that, the more truer it becomes, and so they increase their rationale. That both systems, both the defensive and the offensive systems, are working together here with interests that are increasing the rate of strikeouts.
Okay. Final question here from Scott Bush. If the root cause is a focus on hitting more home runs, shouldn't we change the reward for the hitter? And could we do that by simply moving back or raising the fences so it's more difficult to hit home runs?
Sure. However, the way most stadiums are configured nowadays is that there's a grandstand there. You can't just move the grandstand back. It's not like in the old days where you just move the chain link fence. But theoretically, sure, if you increase the size of the outfield, you make it harder for fielders to cover all that ground, and yeah, you increase the value of balls in play. That definitely would be part of it. I just practically speaking, with the outfield grandstands built the way they are, I just don't think that's very practical.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Steve, for a terrific presentation. Appreciate your time today.
My thanks. Thank you.
All right, before we get to our next presentation, I'd like to remind everybody that SABR members can download all of our digital library publications for free or get 50% discounts off the purchase of paperback editions. More than 70 books are available right now as free downloads through the SABR Digital Library if you are a member, including our most recent title, Pride of Smoketown, the 1935 Pittsburgh Crawfords, edited by Frederick Bush and Bill Nallon. It's an inside look at one of the most dominant teams in Negro Leagues history, with stories about Hall of Famers Cool Papa Bell, Oscar Charleston, Josh Gibson, and Judy Johnson. You can find all SABR Digital Library books online at sabr.org/ebooks. Our next presenter is Nick Elam. Nick is the originator of basketball's Elam ending, which has been implemented since 2017 at TBT, the basketball tournament, and most famously at the 2020 NBA All-Star Game, where it received rave reviews and was incredibly entertaining. Nick has been honored for his work as a keynote speaker at the 2019 Midwest Sports Analytics meeting. Nick is just as passionate about baseball as basketball, and his proposed dynamic strike zone concept, which he'll be talking about today, has been featured on MLB Network's Hot Stove and MLB Now. Nick is an assistant professor of educational leadership at Ball State University. He is a grounds crew member for the Cincinnati Reds, and he is founder and coordinator of M Sports Fans, a special interest group for Mensa members. So Nick, looking forward to your presentation today.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me and see me okay?
We can see you just fine.
Oh, great. Let's try sharing the screen here. Can you see the presentation?
Looks good, yeah.
All right. So we'll get started here in a minute. Steve gave a great presentation right before me, and sounds like he shares a love for baseball as much as I do, but also that he shares some concerns about trends in baseball, the overabundance of strikeouts and walks. And I'm going to do my best with this presentation to see if I can address some of those issues and make the great game of baseball even greater than it is. So am I good to start anytime?
Go right ahead.
All right. So, well, thank you for that nice introduction. Again, my name is Nick Elam. I'm very happy to deliver this presentation on a very special evening for all baseball fans. So the name of this presentation is More Action in Less Time, Introducing the Dynamic Strike Zone Concept. So I'll start by reviewing a little bit about my background. And as much as I love baseball, we'll get into what many see as baseball's two most pressing on-field concerns, and that is the pace and the length of the game and the overabundance of strikeouts and walks. And I would also argue there's an overabundance of home runs, but I think the solution to that is dejuicing the baseballs, which is outside the scope of this presentation. Then we'll get into a key consideration for addressing these concerns: pitches per plate appearance, something that we overlook when we focus maybe too much on time between pitches, and something that has real potential and power to address the length of game concern. Then I'll address the dynamic strike zone concept. I'll introduce that, which I believe has the potential to be the best of many worlds for the game of baseball, a concept that can reduce pitches per plate appearance. It will reduce the length of games, all while increasing balls in play and therefore reducing strikeouts and walks. And we'll talk about some considerations associated with the dynamic strike zone and then have some time for questions. So to give you a little about my background, I just finished my third year as Assistant Professor of Educational Leadership at Ball State University. This comes after starting my career in education at the K-12 level, serving in various roles, including principal, athletic director, math teacher, and baseball coach. And along the way, I've served on the Cincinnati Reds grounds crew, and I've been at Great American Ballpark for summer camp the last few weeks. And I'm especially excited to be at the ballpark this weekend for the start of the season. And as was mentioned in the introduction, my work in sports innovation is best known for the Elam ending for basketball, which has been implemented at TBT, the basketball tournament, the NBA All-Star Game, and on July 25th, will make its FIBA debut in the Canadian Elite Basketball League as the Elam ending concept continues to grow throughout the basketball world. And I've enjoyed opportunities to discuss the dynamic strike zone concept too, including for a written article by Jeff Passan. And it was exciting when he also discussed the merits of the dynamic strike zone concept during a live MLB broadcast on ESPN in 2019. And I had a blast joining MLB Network's Hot Stove and MLB Now in December 2019 to discuss the dynamic strike zone. Interestingly, I also happened to discuss the concept of choose your own adventure playoffs, where the top teams in the league would be able to choose their playoff opponents during the playoffs rather than being automatically locked into a certain spot in the playoff bracket. And it sounds like we might be getting that here in 2020. So I'm excited about that choose your own adventure element of the playoffs. I'm not sure I'm sold on the idea of expanding the playoffs, but I guess 2020 is the perfect year to experiment. So before we get into the dynamic strike zone concept itself, let's back up and talk about the necessity of it. And here you see a few stats related to troubling trends in pace and length of game, or troubling trends regarding the overabundance of strikeouts and walks, or a combination of both, as these concerns are intertwined. And I don't think these figures will be especially surprising to anyone, but I'll give you a minute to look those over. Continuing on with this, SABR member Dave Smith conducted a study that reveals it's actually the number of pitches in a game, not the time between pitches, that has more to do with the increased length of the game. And this is eye-opening because we seem to be preoccupied with the talk of a pitch clock to solve the problem of pace and length of game. It's also worth noting that the number of plate appearances per game has held relatively steady over the last 20 years or so. So it's not as if additional plate appearances are responsible for these additional pitches or additional length of game. So if the number of plate appearances remains fairly steady, then I believe the way to address pitches per game is to address pitches per plate appearance. So let's take a closer look at pitches per plate appearance, because I really think this is the key to addressing baseball's primary concerns. Here you see a plot of the seasons from 1999 through 2019. During that time, average pitches per plate appearance, there along the x-axis, has hovered between about 3.7-ish to 3.9-ish pitches per plate appearance. The length of a 9-inning game, which you see along the y-axis there in minutes, it's hovered between 245-ish to 305-ish. You'll also note that we've got a very strong positive correlation here, correlation coefficient of over 0.7. So as average pitches per plate appearances increases, so does the length of the game, which makes sense. And you'll see that the slope of this line of best fit is about 73.5. So backing that down to a more appropriate scale, and you see this written in bold at the bottom, for every 1/10 of a pitch that the average plate appearance lengthens, the length of the game increases by about 7 minutes. Or vice versa, or the more optimistic way of looking at it, for every 1/10 of a pitch the average plate appearance shortens, the length of the game shortens by about 7 minutes. So I believe that's the key. Is really looking at average pitches per plate appearance. So how do we shorten the length of an average plate appearance? Because doing so even by a little bit can have a major desirable effect on the sport, I believe. Now, one way not to do it would be, say, starting everyone with a 1-1 count. This would certainly reduce pitches per plate appearance, but it would dramatically increase strikeouts and walks, and we already have too many of those as it is. And another way not to decrease pitches per plate appearance is to hope that the game's going to self-correct. If we just leave everything as is, I think that could be troublesome. So, if we leave everything alone, as we've noticed, hitters have become much more selective over the last generation or so. But as Tango Tiger recently revealed in a series of tweets, hitters are probably still too aggressive in most counts, with the possible exception of 2-strike counts. His study looked at not just whether a pitch was a strike or a ball, but actually the proximity of the pitch to the heart of the plate and the runs created or the runs expected on such pitches. He found that really hitters are still too aggressive. So as teams catch on to this, hitters are likely to keep the bat on their shoulder even longer than they already do. So the question is, how do you get the bat off of their shoulder? Manipulating the strike zone is one way to do it, and it's been done a handful of times in the past, as you can see. But I think changing the strike zone across the board would have unintended consequences. So if you shrink the strike zone across the board, yeah, there'll be fewer strikeouts, but hitters are going to be more selective, which means longer plate appearances, which means longer games. And it means even more walks than we already have, and we already have too many walks. If you expand the strike zone across the board, yeah, that'll force hitters to get the bat off their shoulder, which could speed up the games, but it would likely increase strikeouts. We already have too many strikeouts as it is. And so I'm proposing a dynamic strike zone where you would actually shrink and expand the strike zone. The strike zone would start small for each at-bat, a little bit smaller than what we see now. And then after 1 strike, it would expand to about the size that we see now. And after 2 strikes, if the at-bat is still going, it would expand to a size that's a little bit larger than what we see now. And what this would do is this would force pitchers to throw the most favorable pitches early in the at-bat. And for hitters, it would totally get rid of this mindset that I'm going to take pitches or I'm going to work deep counts. Hitters would have a tangible incentive to put the ball in play early in the at-bat. Now, this would require an automated strike zone, which I'm a proponent of anyway. It would take some time to get used to it, especially for hitters. I think hitters would probably be the most outspoken against it initially. But then again, you could easily argue that hitters adjust their strike zone and their selectivity based on the count as it is. So I'm confident that over time they would eventually adjust and they would embrace the approach that they just need to be more aggressive, especially early in the at-bat. Or that they have the opportunity to be more aggressive in the at-bat, I should say, because they're likely to face more favorable pitches with that smaller strike zone. later in the at-bat, they have to be more aggressive because they're working with a larger strike zone. I think fans would enjoy it too. Currently, I think most fans, including myself, we're mainly just interested in the outcome of each at-bat. We aren't as concerned with the path that the at-bat takes to get there. And I think the dynamic strike zone would actually add some intrigue to that pitch-by-pitch path that an at-bat takes to reach its conclusion. Another thing that I think is great is that fans who are concerned with tradition, and I can include myself in that group sometimes, the strike zone boundaries really aren't something that are fully ingrained, I would say. The rule book boundaries of the strike zone have been changed a handful of times throughout baseball history. And I would guess that if you walked up to 10 diehard baseball fans on the street and asked them what are the current rule book boundaries of the strike zone, maybe one of them could tell you correctly. So I think the strike zone is actually fair game to modify if necessary if it can produce a better game. And I think it can, because I think it can have a dramatic impact on pitches per plate appearance, which I think, again, can have that dramatic impact on length of game. So some closing thoughts here, and these are exciting to think about. So as I've mentioned, I really believe that addressing pitches per plate appearance is the way to address the issues of pace and length of game and the overabundance of strikeouts and walks. I know we talk a lot about time between pitches. Maybe there's something there, number of pitches, whatever it might be. But I think if we can reduce the number of pitches per plate appearance, I think that's the way to go. And I think the dynamic strike zone is the way to do it. And I think that doing so would have a very powerful impact. If you were able to reduce that figure of pitches per plate appearances by 0.2 pitches, you could shave almost 15 minutes off of a game. If you knocked it down by 0.3 pitches, you could shave about 22 minutes off of a game. And if you were to knock that figure down by half a pitch, and who knows what the potential is, but if you knock it down by half a pitch per plate appearance, you could shave about 37 minutes off of a game. And what's best is that all these pitches that we'd be losing, these are all filler pitches. We wouldn't be losing any of the action pitches where the outcome of the at-bat is revealed. We would just be losing all the fluff that serves to lengthen the at-bat. We would have just as many action pitches as we have now, maybe even more, and we would actually have more of those action pitches that are put in play because we'd be reducing strikeouts and walks. So you see my references here, and so thank you again for your interest in this topic. Cheers to baseball. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and we have a little bit of time for some questions and comments.
Great. Thank you, Nick. That was extremely informative and very interesting. I think we'll elicit some questions. If anyone in the audience has questions, please type them into the chat window and we will get to them. First question here is from Scott Bush. Have you studied which direction the zone should expand or contract? Or would it be proportional or the same for all hitters across the zone?
Great question. And I guess one thing I'll say up front about this dynamic strike zone concept is that baseball has the opportunity to adjust it over time as necessary. They'd probably have to stick with, they'd probably have to set it before the start of a season. But if the trends aren't what they hope to see for that particular season, they can modify it however they wish. I mean, I guess my thought would be on all sides of the strike zone, you would shrink it initially. And again, after one strike, you would expand it to about the size that you see now. Again, expanding a little bit on all sides. And then, if two strikes, if the at-bat's still going, then expand it again and expand it on all sides. That would a little bit on all sides. That would be my initial way of going about it. But again, if there's certain trends, certain counts that baseball feels could be better, they can modify those boundaries as they see fit to make for the best game possible.
A question here from Neil Traven. Do you think it would be possible for a human umpire to visualize a strike zone that's adjusting by pitch count, or would this system have to be implemented through automated balls and strikes, or robot umpires, as the internet likes to call it?
I think that would be a tough ask for human umpires. I think it's I think it's a tough job as it is. I mean, I have a lot of respect for human umpires as it is, even though I do think that the strike zone should be called in an automated way, whether we stay with a static strike zone or a dynamic strike zone. I think we should have an automated strike zone doing it. But yeah, with the dynamic strike zone, I think you would have to go with an automated strike zone to call that. And so that might limit how far reaching this rule could be. It might be something that's really only realistic at the major league level, or maybe some minor leagues, maybe some independent leagues, leagues that have the means of implementing that. So you might not be able to do this at, say, the high school level or youth level, something like that. But again, I think this could be something that really could improve the product and make the great sport of baseball even greater at the highest level.
That kind of leads into a question here from Perry Barber, one of our SABR members who's been umpiring for 40 years at all levels. She asked about a question about home plate umpire consistency, which is, a concept that most hitters and pitchers understand now. Certain umpires have their own strike zone, and you might be able to get used to that. If human umpires were to be used for this type of system with a dynamic strike zone, how do you think that would work?
Not well. I think it would be, I think Major League Baseball would have to be prepared to implement an automated strike zone. Again, with the automated strike zone that they're discussing now would have to be tailored to the individual batter based on their height and their stance. So, I mean, there's already that little bit of malleability in that automated strike zone that they're discussing. Here, you would just have to add one more dimension, I guess, to that of not only would it depend on the batter's height and the batter's stance, but it will also depend on the count. You just have to add one more setting, and I don't know if it would be programmed to do that, or somebody hits a button that says, okay, well, now we're going to one strike mode, and now we're going to two strike mode. You might even see on the, watching a game on TV on Fox or TBS or whatever, and, the little strike zone graphic would expand as the at-bat deepens. But I think you would have to have an automated strike zone. I think it's just too much to ask of a human umpire to try to differentiate, based on the count, not only based on the batter.
Steve Ruddick asked if it's going to be very difficult for human umpires to arbitrate a dynamic strike zone. How do we imagine that human hitters and pitchers will be able to handle that?
Well, again, I would argue that any pitcher for one, bringing back to the last question, I mean, I think we already know that human umpires have their own strike zone, and we kind of accept that. We even kind of romanticize about that, which is baffling to me sometimes, that we like this idea that each umpire has their own strike zone. So already, before the game even starts, a pitcher or a hitter has to be prepared to adjust for that. But within every at bat of every game, a pitcher adjusts their approach based on the count. How much of a part of the plate or part of the strike zone that they're going to try to carve into. And every at-bat of every game, a hitter also adjusts their approach based on the count, where they are more aggressive or less aggressive based on the count. And that same approach would carry over into a dynamic strike zone. The only difference would be kind of the sequence of it, I guess. Say, when a batter steps into, let's say we implement a dynamic strike zone, a batter steps into the box with a 0-0 count, and they've got that small strike zone to work with. You'd almost have the mentality of having, say, a 2-0 count the way you do now. The hitter would be pretty selective in that count. The pitcher would know that they cannot mess around and allow the count to accumulate without getting any strikes. So again, I think we're already used to those changes of approach, pitch by pitch. It would just change the sequence a little bit.
No, it's a great answer. And I think the mental equations that hitters and pitchers use now is, all in their heads, but they're already doing this, like you said. It's just, this would be, one more factor to consider. So next question from Steve Treder. Why do you think MLB seems to be so much more hesitant than some of the other sports leagues to actively adjust the rules year by year in order to optimize the most entertaining product on the field?
Well, I'm not a spokesperson for Major League Baseball. I'm just a fan, but I do think, if you were to look at the history of rule changes in any sport, it's actually pretty striking how often rules change in every sport. And I think that would include baseball too. I think if you look at the year by year changes, especially in the last, say, 10 years or so, it's pretty striking how many rules really have changed. And especially here in 2020, they're experimenting with so many different rules, even rules that, I'm someone who's all for experimentation and innovative rules. And even I'm looking at some of these rules like, I still don't like the extra inning starting a runner on second base rule, but who knows, maybe I'll be converted. I'm still not sure I like this idea of an expanded playoffs for baseball, but maybe that rule will benefit my Reds. So I'll wait to see on that one. And so, yeah, I think baseball actually does embrace change maybe more than we give it credit for.
Yeah, with the expanded playoffs, that may be changing by the hour today. Who knows, depending on how the negotiations go. Question here from Mike McCullough. Why would a dynamic strike zone make it more likely for a batter to swing earlier? Wouldn't a hitter be more patient holding off on swinging unless the pitch went into the smaller strike zone earlier in the count?
Great question. So I believe that they're not going to swing if they're not getting a good pitch. But the thing is, this is more likely to offer them that good pitch early in the count. So let's back up and think about if we were to change the strike zone across the board. So for a moment, just forget the dynamic strike zone. Let's just say we're going to change the strike zone across the board. If you shrink the strike zone across the board, well, what that's going to do to the heat map of all pitches in all major league games is it's going to condense that heat map of pitches. Let's say we're going to expand the strike zone across the board for all counts, every game, every situation, we're going to expand the strike zone. What that's going to do to the heat map of pitches in all games is it's naturally going to expand that and spread out that heat map a little bit. So now let's think about the dynamic strike zone again and what that would do to the heat map of pitches. Having that small strike zone in every at-bat to start is going to condense the heat map of pitches early in the at-bat. And if you have pitches closer to the heart of the plate, over a large sample early in the at-bat, then hitters are more likely to swing and hitters are more likely to make contact.
Final question here from Steve. Nick, could the Cincinnati Reds use a volunteer grounds crew member for one game this weekend?
That's not out of the question. Although we did got a work schedule for the week, and it looks like we have many people who have signed up and made themselves available for this weekend, especially tomorrow. We're going to have a robust crew on hand for opening day tomorrow. So unfortunately, it's not really my decision to make. But even if it was, I don't know if we have any extra spots. I think they're trying to. One thing I do know is anyone who wants to be on the grounds crew for any team and I can tell you firsthand experience, has to go through a series of many protocols that we haven't had to go through in previous years. And, on top of all of our, the grunt work that we've done in the past that we'll still have to do now, there's a lot of just cleaning and disinfecting work that we've had to do so far in summer camp, and I expect that to continue throughout the season. So, but, again, playing a small part and trying to put on the show and make this season happen, I'm proud to play that small part.
Well, I think I can speak for everyone here and all baseball fans. We appreciate your efforts in bringing us baseball, and happy opening day. and hope you enjoy the weekend and staying safe and healthy. Well, thank you again for your time today at SABR Virtual.
Thank you so much.
All right, before we get to our final presentation, we'll have a little seventh inning stretch here. Thank you again to everybody for joining us on opening day of the 2020 baseball season. Just wanted to remind everybody you have 1 day left to enter the SABR Virtual raffle. You have a chance to win lineup card autographed by Tony Gwynn, Hank Aaron vintage figurine from Heartland, limited edition prints of Lou Gehrig and Old Yankee Stadium, and other baseball memorabilia prizes. Each raffle ticket is $5, and it entitles you to a chance to win any of these memorabilia prizes, which will be drawn at random and announced during the final SABR Virtual session this Sunday, July 26th. You can buy your SABR raffle tickets online at sabr.org/virtual-meetings. So our final cleanup hitter today is Christina Knoedler. Christina is a retired condensed matter physicist with a PhD from the University of Rochester. She helped to develop advanced quantum devices as an industrial physicist at the IBM T.J. Watson Research Center, the Sarnoff Corporation, and Intersil Semiconductor Corporation. During her retirement, she's having fun with baseball physics using computational methods with MLB StatCast data. Outside the ballpark, her interests are gardening, attending physics conferences, and driving her Chevy Camaro SS V8 45th Anniversary Special Edition. Christina's talk today is on Does Weather Affect Pitched Balls? Delving deeper with physics. So Christina, looking forward to your talk today.
Thank you. I'm going to try to share my screen now. Can everybody see that?
Looks good here.
Great. Okay. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everybody for hanging in there. This talk was inspired by an MLB game I saw last summer. The broadcast team was commenting on whether a pitched ball slows down and by how much. To answer this question, I wanted to understand what affects the speed of a pitched ball and what role weather plays in this. I wanted to look at the velocity at the front of home plate from the batter's perspective. And I want to examine the drag force on a pitched ball. So the ball moves through the air. This is a fluid. This slows the ball down, and this is drag. So what affects this fluid? What affects the air? Temperature, pressure, altitude, and relative humidity. These are our environmental variables. And I wanted to know, are these strong or weak influences? And how can available technology help us with this problem? And I wanted to answer a question from common baseball lore. A fastball is faster on a hot, dry day. Is this true? But more importantly, I wanted to answer why. So our available technology is MLB StatCast for 2019, which I believe is changing this very minute, where they're going to use the Hawkeye system, and Baseball Savant. So these are the components of MLB StatCast. And I'm concentrating on the TrackMan system that provides Doppler radars. That measures the ball position and speed out of the pitcher's hand and at home plate, the ball initial velocities and accelerations. And I want to use Baseball Savant, which takes all these components of MLB StatCast, puts them into a searchable database. This database was developed and maintained by Darren Willman. It's an easy search engine to use, and more importantly, it has downloadable results. So for the 2019 season and postseason, I chose random games throughout the season. I limited to 4-seam fastball pitches. I used Baseball Savant data for the release speed of the pitch, and I used MLB game day data for the home plate velocity. Here's a plot of these pitches. On the left side, the vertical axis is the speed, and on the horizontal axis is the number of pitches. The black line is the release speed out of the pitcher's hand, and the red line is the plate speed. Let's look at an analysis of this plot. Okay, it spans opening day to the World Series. This is data for different games, different stadiums, pitchers, and weather conditions. You can see that the home plate speed in red tracks the release speed. But this is noisy data, so we're going to replot it. And what I did was plot it in increments of 1 mile per hour for the release speed. And you can see there's a black dotted line. That's the trend line for the release speed. And this is the equation for that line. And then we have the plate speed and its trend line dotted red with its trend line. And you'll notice that there is structure in this plate speed. So again, let's look at the analysis for this data. It goes from 88 miles per hour to 100 miles per hour. And the home plate speed tracks the release speed as we saw before. But you can see there's a uniform decrease in the ball speed. The slopes of these two lines are parallel. And that difference, that decrease, is 7.5 miles per hour on average. So the ball is slower at the plate than when it's released. This is due to air resistance drag. So the ball arrives with about 91% of the release speed. So what do we learn from this graph? Overall, to 0th order, there are no major effects seen for a particular stadium or particular weather conditions. No differences were seen for pitchers. But as I said before, there is structure in the plate speed data. So we're going to look at this deeper, and now we're going to look at some physics. Okay, so here's the ball traveling out of the pitcher's hand, and there's 3 major forces on the baseball in flight. So the black line is the ball velocity as it goes towards the plate. Opposing that velocity is the blue line. That's the drag force. The other forces on the ball are the force due to gravity, the green line, and the lift, or the orange line, or what's called the Magnus force, due to the spin of the ball. But I'm only worried about the velocity of the ball at home plate. I'm not worried about the ball position, the height, or the deflection at home plate. And I'm not going to bring in the force of the wind. It's too difficult at this stage to bring in the wind pattern within a stadium. So we have the drag force, the force due to gravity, and the Magnus force. We're not going to look at gravity. We're not going to look at the Magnus force. But we're left with the drag force. And this is the equation for drag. And on the next slide, I have that printed out again and now expanded here. So just quickly to go through this. The drag force is equal mass times acceleration. That's just Newton's law. You learned that in school. It's equal to minus, that's a negative sign because it opposes the velocity of the ball. We have 1/2 the drag coefficient times the air density, rho, times the cross-sectional area of the ball, times the vector velocity of the ball. But for computational purposes, we're interested in the ball velocity. So after going through some rearrangements, we have what's called a standard Euler approach. So to get the velocity, the next velocity element, you take the previous velocity component and subtract off this term. So what we see here, this is a constant, so we're not going to worry about that. We have the drag coefficient times the air density times the absolute value of the velocity, and then the velocity in a particular direction. In this case, it's the y direction, times a time step, tau, which is also basically a constant for each step. Now, what I'm trying to do and modeling this is something we call a toy model. It's a tiny population, and it falls far short of the complexity of real baseball. But it's healthy to engage these smaller models. It allows us to be experimentalists. And we use quantitative information. So for me, TrackMan is my physics measurement system. Toy models allow us to move ahead in a controlled fashion. I can start simple and then gradually layer on more complexity. So we're going to start simple. So we need a yardstick for comparison of all these foreseen fastball results. I want to examine the change in the pitched ball velocity over a known distance. So I want to use the TrackMan initial velocity point. That's VY0 in MLB Baseball Savant. If any of you have downloaded this data, you see there's a VX0, a VY0, and a VZ0. We're using the initial velocity point, VY0. and then to the point in front of home plate. This is the plate velocity that's given in MLB game data. So what I'm going to do is look at speed difference, the initial speed minus the plate speed. This is a better measurement than the pitcher release speed minus the plate speed, because each pitcher's extension varies, so that distance varies. So this is not a good measure. This is not a good choice. But I will return to this at the end of the talk, the release speed minus the plate speed. So here we have speed difference equals initial speed minus plate speed. It tells us how much the ball slows down on its way to home plate. Larger difference, ball arrives at the plate later. Ball is slower, there's more drag. Smaller difference, the ball arrives at the plate sooner. The ball is faster, less drag. So here's a quick rundown of my computer program. It's a dynamic physics-based model. It's programmed in the Python language. Input variables are stadium-specific variables, altitude, open, or domed. I use, from a paper by Kensrud and Smith, the drag coefficient data. I use Savant search data results, and this data is directly imported into the program. And another technology that's been very invaluable and it is available is the weather data from the National Weather Service. So I take a National Weather Service station and I pair it with a stadium. I consider distance and altitude in order to pair them. They give hourly weather, so I can follow the changing weather conditions during the game and during pitches. So I look at temperature, pressure, altitude, relative humidity, or dew point. Okay, the program calculates parameters needed for the trajectory. It calculates the ball angle out of the pitcher's hand. It calculates factors from the weather data, the moist air density. It uses the previous velocity equation. And the output is a baseball trajectory and velocities anywhere from out of hand to home plate. Now, I also compared my calculated results to Savant input data. As a check, my calculated data was within less than 1% of the Savant values, which means I can use the program to model different variable effects. So here we go back to this plot that we saw before, and I've marked off with green arrows some of the more interesting peaks and valleys, and we're going to look at this data in the plate speed data. Here's a chart for those green arrows. You can see here's the home team stadiums: Colorado, Arizona, Atlanta, Pittsburgh, New York, Philly, and Washington. The temperature varied anywhere from 45 degrees to 95. And by the way, that day in Arizona, they actually had the dome open. The relative humidity goes from 10% to 89%. Now, when we look at pressure for this program, we're using what's called station pressure. That's the pressure at altitude. I'm not using what the meteorologist usually gives you as pressure on the evening weather. Here's the Savant release speeds out of the pitcher's hand, the Savant initial velocities, and then the plate velocities that I calculated, and then the initial minus plate speed. I also incorporated the drag coefficient from the paper previously mentioned and the air density factors. So let's go back to our velocity equation. And the velocity or speed mainly is dependent on the drag coefficient and the air density. And as I said before, the A over 2m factor and tau are just constants or fixed time increments. So first, let's look at the speed dependence on the drag coefficient. But we need to understand the drag coefficient. Okay, this is the dimensionless quantity used to quantify aerodynamic drag. It depends on the surface roughness, orientation, and speed of the ball. And with a baseball, obviously, you have the stitches which add to the roughness. It's measured in a laboratory in static air using light gates rather than in a wind tunnel where you have a mount which can interfere with this determination. This is the data that I used, and I used figure 7, which was for MLB baseballs. Here's a plot of this data. So here's the drag coefficient for MLB baseballs. Here's the ball speed, and here's the drag coefficient. And they go from 38 miles per hour to about 135. But for the purposes of this study, we're only interested in this little region in here. And I replotted that over here. The dotted line is I did a cubic fit to his data over here. And this is the cubic fit here. You can see the blue dotted line running through that. Now, here is the first initial minus plate speed, the speed difference versus the drag coefficient. And here are all the stadiums plotted and the release speed of the ball. Now, our plot analysis shows us that the drag coefficient versus the ball speed, it looks like that plot. So the higher ball speed, the 99.8, has the lower drag coefficient, and the lower speed has the higher. But these are all scattered data points, so there's no obvious correlation right out with the drag coefficient. So let's look at the next factor. That's the air density, rho. We're going to plot speed difference, initial minus plate velocity, versus moist air density, which is correlated with humidity, how much water vapor is in the air. And then I'm going to plot the same thing versus dry air density, which does not include water vapor in the air. Here's this plot. Again, initial minus plate speed on the vertical axis and the moist air density here. And you can see the layout here of the various stadiums and conditions. And this is the blue trend line and the equation for that trend line. Overlaid on that is the dry air density. These results plotted for dry air density. You can see they totally overlay. The trend line is almost identical. Here's its equation, and you can see the data points here. So again, let's look at this plot analysis. There's a linear dependence. The data looks very nice here. Speed difference versus air density. And remember, this is different conditions. This is different stadiums, different weather, different pitches. What you can conclude from this plot is it's not dependent on humidity. Moist air versus dry air, there's basically no difference. And let me point out from the beginning, Colorado here has the smallest speed difference, and Washington has the larger speed difference. Now let's look at these two factors together, which is the heart of the equation. So again, we're going to plot speed difference against CD rho moist and CD rho dry. And here you can see basically the same plot, but it sort of levels off as we go to higher CD rho. Again, it's essentially following the same plot as before with the speed difference versus air density. And this is a second order polynomial fit. A linear fit just really wouldn't do in this case. So we want to understand what's going on here. We want to understand what the dependencies are. So we want to look at the heart of the velocity equation, which I pointed out was CD rho. So let's take rho and let's just expand it. So that's just the moist air density. So that's made up of the dry air density minus the dry air density times this factor here. Now let's expand the dry air density. That's just the station pressure over the ideal gas constant here, R air, over temperature. So combining, putting the drag coefficient in here times the moist air density, we have this equation here. And I've gone through the drag coefficient, the station pressure. This is the ideal gas constant for air. And this term here is what's called saturation vapor pressure at the dew point. That brings in the humidity. But what we find out with this equation is that this last factor is a very small number. It's 0.2% of this leading term. So basically, we can get rid of this term. We can neglect it. So we're left with CD rho is approximately the drag coefficient, the station pressure over the ideal gas constant, and temperature. Now here, pressure, temperature, and CD, these are linked in regard to ball speed. Drag coefficient, as we saw on that plot, only moderates slightly, but remember, this is for four-seam fastball pitches. Air density is directly proportional to the station pressure, and it's inversely proportional to temperature. Game day humidity does not play a role in speed difference. So here's our conclusions. How weather affects pitched balls. Through the air density rho. Rho, as I said, is directly proportional to pressure and inversely to temperature. Remember, that's station pressure. So baseball travels fastest when the air density rho is lowest. That can come from high temperatures and very low pressure or high altitude. They play a role. And that's Colorado Coors Field results, smaller speed difference. Baseball travels slowest when the air density rho is highest. Lower temperatures, sea level pressures contribute. That's Washington, D.C., Nationals Park, results larger speed difference. Now we're going to go back here to release speed. This time I want to illustrate that for a given pitcher, he's going to have the same, basically the same extension, and he's going to have the same release speed. So here I took 3 pitchers, Genesis Cabrera, Jonathan Hicks, and Aaron Nola, and their release speeds and the calculated play speed. And for Colorado, it's about 6.3 miles per hour. Now, you put these same pitchers in Washington, and you have the same release speeds, but the plate speed has changed. And the release minus plate speed is about 8.3 miles per hour. So the difference between Colorado and Washington is a pitched ball is going about 2 miles per hour faster on a hot, dry day in Coors Field than on a cold day in Nationals Park. So to answer the initial question from common baseball lore, fastball is faster on a hot, dry day. Is it true? Yes, because of the air density. And these are my references. Dr. Alan Nathan maintains a website called The Physics of Baseball. So if you're interested in any of this, please go to his website. It's very informative. One of the papers I pulled from there is looking at TrackMan, testing TrackMan. How well does TrackMan work? And that was done in collaboration with Jeff Kensrud and Lloyd Smith and Eric Lang. Again, their paper, Jeff Kensrud and Smith, in situ drag measurements. And I use computational physics by Nick Giordano for the help with the baseball program. And of course, Baseball Savant and Baseball Reference. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for hanging in there.
Thank you very much, Christina. That was a terrific presentation. I think a lot of the comments are echoing the same. Perry Barber said she is totally awed by the meticulous research and analysis here. So,
thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Let's get to a few questions while we have time. If anybody has any questions for Christina, please type them into the chat and we will relay them to her. First question comes from Allison Levin. You looked at 4-seam fastballs in this study. Do you think that results would be any different if you had looked at other types of pitches?
I think the 2-seam fastballs would probably be about the same. I'm really not sure whether curveballs or changeups or things like that would be different. In fact, I'd like to continue the study and look at more of those balls and see what I can find out.
Okay. Speaking of the baseballs, I know we've had some research at the SABR Analytics Conference and other places on the changing baseballs. With regards to drag, Allison asked a follow-up question here. How dependent is the drag on the baseball being used in a given year?
Okay, I'm not sure I quite understand the question there. I know Meredith Wills did talk at the analytics conference about there was some change in the manufacture of the balls and talking about the surge in home runs. It could be that if the leather was somehow smoother and the stitches were lower. Remember I talked about that the drag coefficient depended on the roughness of the ball. So that could change. Yes, the drag coefficient could change. But as you saw for the 4-seam fastballs and the speed of the pitch, I was in a very narrow region on that plot. So it may not matter for 4-seam fastballs. It may matter for where you have spin involved and curveballs and balls like that.
Speaking of spin, Scott Fishtall asks, Given pitchers' current focus on spin rates, would looking at the Magnus force have any effect on this type of study?
Not on this per se. What it would have to do is with the deflection at home plate. So in other words, whether the ball is deflected right or left from the batter and up or down. Now, a lot of that, the X and Y positions and Z positions for the ball is given in baseball savant. So I could model it and compare it with the savant results. The problem comes about is the data that, at least we were using TrackMan. I do not know, I will know tonight maybe, or tomorrow with Hawkeye's system. The one thing we lack in the output is the tilt of the ball. So for instance, when a four-seam fastball is released, you're assuming that, and this is the right-hand rule, you're assuming the spin axis is horizontal. But if the pitcher changes his arm position, the tilt angle might be in this direction, so you could get a different deflection because the Magnus force is in a different direction, therefore. But I don't think it won't really affect the velocity at home plate.
Tara Krieger asked, the study examines its pitch speed, velocity, but what effect would weather have on pitch location as well?
Not sure about that. Not sure about that. As I said in the equation, that second component of the equation really is just a very small factor, and it really depends on the first component, which is fairly simple. What may affect it or affects it most is the spin. So if the ball got, I would say, moist. Now, I know they put them in humidors before the games to try to keep them all the same temperature. That's more for the coefficient of restitution for the hitters when the ball is hit. But if a ball would pick up a lot of moisture, yeah, that could change it.
Perry Barber asked, do weather conditions affect balls after they're hit as opposed to while they're on their way to the plate?
It's the same thing. Alan Nathan has done a large amount of work on that with the hit ball. And again, the problem with that is you do not have really the tilt for the hit ball or the spin for the hit ball. That's a problem. It's very hard to determine how far the ball is going. You can back calculate, which I believe Dr. Nathan has done, and figure out what the spin might be. But again, you're missing the actual spin number. You're missing the tilt on the ball as it leaves the bat. And I believe TrackMan could have had those numbers, and I'm sure Hawkeye can give those numbers. And it's just that they're not posted, and it would be a great thing for us physicists to get those numbers. We would love to have them.
Sure. You mentioned a couple Colorado Rockies pitchers in your study, and of course, we've heard for years about pitchers going to the Rockies and all of a sudden their curveballs don't curve or things like that. Were there any pitchers that you found in your study that were more adversely affected by weather conditions at different ballparks?
I didn't particularly look at particular pitchers. I was more interested in just the velocities and the difference in velocities, and it's a small amount. So for the pitchers, no. I would say for the four-seam fastballs, no. You're basically getting all the same results there.
Interesting. All right. Well, thank you again for this terrific presentation. One of the most entertaining and interesting that I've heard in a long time. So appreciate your time here at SABR Virtual.
Thank you. And thanks for everybody else for hanging in there.
All right. Well, that wraps up day 9 of SABR Virtual. Thank you all for attending today on opening day of the 2020 season. Today's presentations will be posted online on SABR's YouTube channel afterwards if you want to go back and watch them again. You can find the complete schedule or register to attend tomorrow's SABR Virtual on our website at sabr.org. Thanks again to Steve Treder, Nick Elam, Christina Knoedler, and Chuck Hildebrandt for their presentations today. And hope we'll see you tomorrow at SABR Virtual. Thank you.
Thank you.